step inside the crowded mathematics hall at Blackstone University. More than 200 academics laughed as the prestigious professor mocked a humble janitor. He stood there quietly, simply leaning on his mop. He can't even count cleaning supplies, and you think he understands complex math structures. Her voice dripped with academic arrogance. The crowd laughed it off, but the quiet worker said nothing. He quietly took off his gloves, stepped to the board, and studied the formula that had defeated these scholars for 3 hours. Then he calmly picked up the chalk. These proud scholars had never really looked at his face. For 4 long years, Nathan Cole had walked these grand university halls only after midnight. Just a quiet genius in gray coveralls, pushing his heavy mop bucket down empty hallways while the rest of the city slept. He always cleaned the dusty boards last, because he loved deciphering the complex formulas left behind before wiping them away. But no soul had ever caught him reading. They never looked past the uniform to see the brilliance. He went home to a tiny walk-up near the elevated train in an old building where radiators clanked all winter long and drafty windows never sealed. And keeping up with the rent was a constant struggle. By day he fixed heavy sewing machines in a cluttered workshop off Cermak Road. And at night he returned to this grand temple of complex formulas and tenured egos, washing floors for a meager wage that barely paid for his heating. He kept his head down and asked no questions, never staying a single minute longer than his shift required. But you and I know that true genius often hides behind a humble uniform. Nathan once belonged here. He was once a promising math major studying at a small college in Iowa before crippling family medical debt crushed his dreams. He was forced to drop out mid-semester, and he never had the chance to go back. The expensive textbooks he couldn't afford were salvaged from trash bins outside the university library, thrown away for recycling at the end of the year. He studied them on rattling trains and during his brief work breaks, filling the margins with brilliant, precise formulas of his own, proving that true wisdom never requires a degree. Meanwhile, Professor Evelyn Carrington was the celebrated face of mathematics. Her portrait hung proudly in the lobby alongside legendary award winners. Her elite lectures regularly packed the grandest auditoriums on campus. She believed with absolute certainty that true mathematical genius was rare. That genius only belonged to privileged minds groomed in prestigious schools. Everyone else outside those walls was just unimportant background noise to her. To her, a man in a work uniform was just background furniture, completely blind to the genius before her. This evening, the flagship symposium had begun. A prestigious spring event hosted by Evelyn, attracting elite department leaders and visiting scholars from all over the country. The main challenge was a famous unsolved theorem in advanced topology, an elusive riddle that had quietly stumped specialists for nearly a generation. 10 years passed without a single clean proof. She framed the challenge as a matter of honor. These great minds tried solving it together on the blackboard. For 3 hours they struggled. A prestigious Stanford professor covered half the blackboard with a massive chain of substitutions which collapsed the moment a student spotted one simple sign error. An esteemed Berkeley theorist suggested topology, but Evelyn dismissed his ideas within 20 minutes. Chalk dust hung quietly in the warm air. Empty coffee cups piled up on the side tables. By the 3rd hour, we could feel the room turn tense and sour, heavy with the pride of experts who refused to admit they were stuck. But in the back, Nathan was quietly working. He wiped down wooden armrests with a soft cloth, listening closely to their debate because he simply could not help himself. He had actually read about this exact problem too. Summers ago, in a discarded academic journal he found behind the faculty lounge, and he had quietly thought about it on the train for months afterward. In fact, as we will see, he had pondered it until he understood what the entire room did not. The error was not in their written calculations. It was a blind spot they had carried for years. It hid inside a basic assumption they blindly accepted before any of them even touched the chalk. Just a small silent assumption about how the mathematical space behaved at its boundary. From that single mistake, every path forward bent the wrong way. These experts were not failing to solve the problem. They were solving a different, imaginary problem, and he never meant to speak those thoughts out loud. The truth escaped him quietly, whispered somewhere between a passing thought and a comment to no one. "The premise is wrong." He murmured those words while wiping down an empty wooden seat in the fourth row from the back. Two young graduate students in the row ahead of him turned around. One of them, a student named Daniel Hayes, let out a mocking, surprised laugh, and his friend joined in. The mocking sound carried. Within seconds, half the room turned to stare at the back, where a man in simple gray coveralls stood holding a cleaning rag. Evelyn slowly stepped down from her elevated platform. She walked up the center aisle with the condescending, patient smile of someone who was eager to enjoy the public humiliation about to unfold. Stopping just 2 rows away, she addressed the crowded room while staring directly at his face. "It seems," she said, "that we have a profound contribution from the back of the room." A few scholars chuckled, and she gladly let them. Then she gestured mockingly at his cart, his mop, and the plastic cleaning bottles lined up on his shelf. "He can't even count cleaning supplies correctly. And you think he understands advanced theorem structures?" Mocking laughter swept the room in a wave. Not the loud kind that fills a hall and presses against the walls. Nathan stood perfectly still. He was used to being underestimated in rooms like this. He had been made to feel smaller before. What he felt now was not humiliation. It was a quieter, much older feeling. The sad realization that the world often decides in advance, based on a uniform where we are allowed to stand. He looked down at his working hands, at the cracked skin across his knuckles. He looked at the cleaning cloth in his hands. He thought of his cheap apartment near the train, and the pile of unopened bills on his counter. The careful arithmetic he calculated every single Friday just to survive another week. He remembered the old math textbooks in the crate under his bed, covered with his notes. It would be so incredibly easy to just turn around, to push his cleaning cart out and save his job. No academic in this room would ever notice his absence. Instead, he laid his cleaning cloth down on an empty seat. He slowly pulled off his dirty work gloves, folding them neatly into the front pocket of his coveralls. The mocking laughter began to fade as the surrounding scholars realized what this janitor was doing. He stepped past the shocked graduate students, walking down the center aisle past Evelyn. She just watched him walk by with an arrogant smile fixed on her face. His mop bucket sat forgotten in the aisle. Walking right to the front, he stopped before the massive chalkboard. Above him sat the legendary unsolved problem, surrounded by 3 hours of failed scribbles from the university's elite minds. He picked up a piece of chalk from the tray. The entire lecture hall fell into a heavy absolute silence. Even Evelyn fell completely silent. She stood at the edge of the stage, arms crossed, waiting for his public failure. She wanted him to fail, proving that a mere janitor could never belong here. But Nathan did not even bother to look back. His eyes remained locked on the blackboard. He raised his hand, holding the chalk just inches from the slate, as if visualizing a path these elite scholars were completely blind to. He began writing in the top left corner, directly beneath the famous unsolved theorem. He did not erase any of the professor's failed work. Instead, he drew a single vertical line down the center of the board. He began his proof on the right side, leaving their complex failures on display. His writing was incredibly neat and precise, the steady hand of a genius who practiced in textbook margins. As the chalk clicked softly against the slate, a low murmur rippled through the audience. The mathematical notation he chose was far older than what these academics used. It was an elegant shorthand from an old 1970s textbook that had long been forgotten by modern universities. A graduate student in the front row leaned forward. She whispered softly to her immediate neighbor. Behind her, a visiting professor let out a dismissive scoff, quickly trying to hide it with a dry cough. Professor Richard Brennan, from Berkeley, stood up. This was the famous theorist that Evelyn had rudely dismissed just moments ago. His professional pride was wounded, unable to tolerate an uneducated janitor touching their sacred board. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "Could you explain what you think that old symbol means? Because in real academic institutions we use modern conventions." A wave of smug laughter filled the room. Brennan stood with arms crossed, waiting for a breakdown. But Nathan answered without turning. "It means the same thing either way. The older form is shorter." "I'll switch if it helps," he kept writing. His chalk line reached the bottom right of the blackboard, and he quietly started a second column beneath it. Daniel Hayes, the elite graduate student who first laughed from the back row. He had crept down to the second row, while everyone was walking to the front. Now he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, completely transfixed by the moving chalk. The smug smile he wore earlier had vanished. He was dead silent. What this quiet janitor was doing, slowly and without boasting, was tracing a single thread of truth through those 3 hours of failed scholarly work. With a simple arrow, he connected one of the elite professor's steps to a mistake Evelyn had made near the top. And then he drew another arrow, pointing straight back to the original theorem. The simple lines formed a closed loop. Inside that loop, with 2 quick strokes of chalk, he drew a question mark. "This is the assumption," he said, still facing the board. "Everyone in this room accepted it before the work started. You assumed the underlying space behaves the same way at its boundary as it does in the interior. It doesn't. Once that's true, every step above this line is solving a problem that doesn't exist." The murmurs faded into silence. Evelyn stepped closer to the board, unable to speak. She stared at what this janitor had written, processing it over and over. Her jaw tightened with a tension that even the front rows could easily see. The energy in the room had shifted, completely captured by his quiet brilliance. Those arrogant graduate students in the front rows slowly set down their phones. The visiting scholars stopped exchanging those smug, knowing glances they had traded all evening. Even Brennan slowly sat back down. The crowd was no longer just watching a blue-collar worker with chalk. They were watching something else entirely now. A revelation they were completely unprepared for, and Nathan kept writing. From that simple question mark, he unlocked an entirely new path of reasoning. He did not argue with the failed attempts written above him. He simply ignored them, building beautifully from a clean, flawless foundation at the bottom of the board. His logic was beautifully unorthodox, completely ignoring the worn paths of the so-called experts. He folded the complex problem in half along an axis these elite scholars never even saw. "What he's doing," came a stunned whisper from the middle of the crowded auditorium, "is redefining the entire boundary condition." It was Margaret Whitlock, a veteran visiting mathematician, watching the board in absolute disbelief. She sat on the very edge of her seat, her glasses pushed up into her hair, staring at the blackboard with absolute, breathless focus, entirely forgetting she was surrounded by a room full of people. Evelyn heard her. She heard everything. She glanced briefly toward her esteemed colleague before snapping her eyes back to the board. And for the first time tonight, the professor's face lost all its practiced arrogance. She was actually reading his work. She analyzed it with the deep respect she usually reserved only for peer-reviewed journals. The review board stared at the board, hunting for a single crack, desperate to tear down this outsider's brilliant work. She found absolutely nothing wrong. The man standing there in work coveralls was not guessing at all. He was not winging it. He drew from a massive, beautiful structure he had held in his mind for years, and it was entirely correct. Worse for them, it was elegant. It was the very elegance she spent her career lecturing students to create, recognize, and defend against those they deemed lesser. Yet she had never created anything like it, and she knew it. The sudden realization that genius was standing right before her sank into her chest like a cold, heavy stone. The silent room felt the shift before they truly understood. The mockery that filled the air when she first pointed him out was gone now, replaced by an uneasy, growing awe. Whatever happened next, the elite's comfortable story about who belongs in this room was completely shattered. Evelyn made her move, stepping onto the stage right next to him. Forcing him to feel her academic authority, she spoke to the board instead of him. "Let us slow down." She spoke with the cold, calculated tone reserved for her university seminars. "I want to see this proven step by step with rigor, up to the exact standards we demand in this department." Nathan slowly lowered the chalk. "Your move from the 3rd line to the 4th, she pushed, claims a continuity result. Prove it, name the theorem, detail every single condition." She waved toward the chalkboard, masking her trap as a polite invitation. Her voice was flawless in its politeness, the kind that shuts the door on outsiders. He stared at the math. He knew the truth of it instantly. He had carried that deep truth for years. He had discovered it the way real wisdom is often found, outside any classroom. By sketching on scraps during his commute and tracing shapes on paper napkins. By following the natural patterns until the truth became entirely obvious. No one had ever demanded he memorize academic labels for his insights. He had never needed to dress his brilliance in the rigid format that gatekeepers demand. He knew the concepts intimately. He could feel the exact logic guiding his hand. Yet the dry name of the scholar who first published it slipped from his mind. It works because of a standard continuity argument, he said. Which one? Evelyn was not asking, she was laying a trap. He offered a name, it was close but missed the precise academic label. Instantly, a Stanford professor in the front rows scoffed, eager to protect their exclusive club. Brennan stood up, the intellectual tide turned against him. Attacks came from all sides. Brennan was the first to attack the next line. The elite Stanford lecturer picked apart the following proof. Young assistant professor down the aisle chimed in, desperate to impress the senior staff, demanding Nathan define a term he had naturally used 4 minutes earlier. The doubts were fair in theory, the same trials they forced on any visiting academic. Yet they were precisely the traps designed to trip up untutored genius. He was a self-taught mind raised on discarded textbooks, never expected to prove his worth before 200 scholars. Nathan answered the first equation. He tackled the second one more slowly and deliberately. He solved the third step correctly. But he used mathematics vocabulary a decade out of date. And Professor Brennan corrected him, a small, satisfied smirk tightening his lips. The fourth question caught him between two ways of proving the same truth, forcing a pause mid-sentence to find the exact formal phrasing. The heavy silence that filled the lecture hall stretched out far too long. Evelyn observed the growing silence, making no effort to break it. She allowed that tension to linger until every academic in the room felt it. He arrived at the penultimate step. The blackboard behind him was nearly covered in equations. His elegant, simple handwriting threaded cleanly around the failed attempts of the academic elites before him. His brilliant, self-made logic held firm. He could see the final breakthrough he needed to make. He had envisioned the solution from the moment he first grabbed the chalk. The problem was translating the beautiful truth in his mind into the rigid language on the board. He had to express it in a way these decorated scholars would accept. He required an advanced mathematical theorem he had glimpsed in a discarded journal 3 years ago but had never actually tested. He began the final line. He chalked 3 symbols, then paused. Staring at the equation, he knew it was imperfect, or at least incomplete, and in that intense moment he could not see the bridge to correct it. His hand remained suspended near the blackboard. A fine layer of white chalk dust settled across his weathered working-class wrist. Behind his back, the elite's mockery began to return. This time it was quieter, sharper, fueled by the scholar's own relieved arrogance. The first smirk came from an assistant professor down the aisle, who turned toward his peer. He shared a smug, highly relieved smile. Soon, the mocking laughter rippled through the middle rows, spreading from peer to peer like a wildfire burning through dry grass. Professor Brennan folded his arms, looking completely and openly satisfied. Evelyn stepped slightly closer to him. She did not need to raise her voice to command the room. This, she murmured quietly, her voice carrying just to the front rows, is why mathematics is not a field for amateurs. The insult hit home. Those sitting in the back rows leaned forward to whisper to colleagues, asking what she had said as the cruel words rippled backward through the massive auditorium. By the time the message reached the back, the mocking laughter had followed it. The quiet genius stood there, ignoring their elitist mockery. The massive board in front of him was covered in his brilliant, unappreciated work, save for one stubborn, incomplete line at the very bottom. His hand remained poised midair. He felt a tiny tremor shake his calloused fingers, watching the fine white dust drift slowly against the dark, unforgiving slate. A painful thought surfaced. He should have stayed hidden in the shadows of the room. He envisioned his simple mop bucket resting quietly in the aisle behind him, forgotten and sitting slightly tilted on the expensive carpet. He thought of the unpaid bills waiting on his kitchen counter, and of how late he would return home to his ordinary, unsung life. He thought about how easy it had been to believe for 40 minutes that this room might actually see his genius. He lowered the chalk, refusing to face them yet. Behind him, the soft, arrogant laughter echoed with certainty. It was the sound of an elite space reasserting its old, rigid boundaries. You and I know that smug murmur of an elite crowd that has already decided a man's place. They were only waiting for him to admit his place. Nathan refused to turn around. He kept his eyes on the unfinished formula at the bottom, staring at the 3 small symbols written in the wrong academic order. He stood incredibly still amidst their mockery. For the first time since walking down that aisle, he actually remembered what he was trying to achieve. He had merely been answering their questions. He had been citing their academic theorems in their language, exactly how they demanded it. He had been scaling a ladder built by arrogant scholars against the wrong wall entirely. Rung by cautious rung. He had done it because he spent his whole life believing their lie that this was the only path. But the pure genius in his head looked nothing like that. It had never ever looked that way. It was not a cold list of citations, but a living shape. He had envisioned it on the train one winter morning, watching the massive steel beams of the elevated tracks fold over each other at the Garfield station. And he understood it, the way you and I know the lines of our own hands. He realized the boundary of this complex theorem behaved just like those heavy steel beams. The massive math problem collapsed into something beautifully simple the moment you let yourself look at it from the side, not from above. He had never dared to write it down that way out of fear. He spent 40 minutes trying to force his beautiful shape into their dry formulas, and it was suffocating him. These scholars weren't laughing because his math was actually wrong. They laughed because he had agreed to play their game on their prestigious terms. He remembered the dusty milk crate of advanced textbooks under his bed, and the precise, self-taught handwriting in the margins. He realized he had only 2 choices left in the next 60 seconds. He could compromise, finish the formula their way, and walk out defeated, slipping out the side door with what remained of his dignity. Or he could trust the raw, brilliant vision he had carried for 9 years, showing these arrogant professors what true genius looks like. He raised his calloused hand and pressed it flat against the blackboard. He dragged his rough palm across the slate. He wiped away all the formal, rigid steps he had tried to construct on the professor's arrogant questioning, the academic barrier that had blocked him just a minute earlier. But he left the question mark untouched inside the closed loop at the top. And he did not touch the original statement of the theorem. Everything else he swept away. White chalk dust fell onto his work coveralls, landing softly on the stage at his feet. The condescending laughter behind him faltered, slowly fading away. A few professors fell silent first, then the rows behind them. And then, as you and I might expect, the entire grand hall fell completely, breathtakingly silent. As he finally set down the eraser, the quiet in the grand hall was absolute, broken only by his steady breath. He picked up the chalk once more. He stared at the empty center of the board, offering no fancy citations to back up his thoughts. Instead, he drew a simple diagram, nothing like the complex figures these scholars expected. At first glance, it resembled the crossed metal beams of a basic industrial frame, just like a blue-collar worker might sketch a quick repair on a work order. He sketched it small and clean, quietly labeling each of the corners. "This is the space in the theorem," he said. His voice had grown completely steady now, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who truly saw the truth. He drew a second figure next to it, identical but rotated by a quarter turn. And this is the space looked at from above. The boundary behaves differently in the 2 views. Every proof attempted in this room tonight used the second view. The theorem actually asks about the first. Then he began to bend the math along a dimension those experts had completely missed. He worked his way down from the diagrams, and his elegant solution looked nothing like the messy failures scrawled above it. It required no academic citations. It only needed those raw sketches and a few clean geometric steps. Every single step was something any honest person in the crowd could verify just by looking. He used the old school notation again, and this time no one dared correct him, because it made his drawings fit perfectly. Margaret Whitlock leaned forward in her chair. Her reading glasses remained pushed up in her hair. Her jaw was slightly slack, and she didn't even realize she was staring. Brennan, sitting just 2 rows ahead, had stopped crossing his arms defensively. His hands rested quietly on his knees. Meanwhile, Nathan just kept on writing. His sketches began to multiply across the lower blackboard. Every new drawing stripped away another layer of complexity. By the third sketch, his brilliant logic was unmistakable. By the fifth drawing, the path to the solution was as clear as light at the end of a very long tunnel. By the sixth step, he wasn't just proving their theorem. He was unlocking a truth far larger than that. Then he stopped, quietly examining what he had created. He walked back to the original formulation of the problem up top and drew a neat, quiet bracket around it. Right next to it, with his steady, working-class hand, he wrote a brand-new statement. He had generalized the entire theorem. It solved not just the single case these professors had gathered to debate, but a whole family of math they hadn't even named. His final generalization was only 3 lines. It was the sort of profound truth that, written on any other board, and by a titled scholar, would have launched some careers and ruined others. He set the chalk back on the tray and stepped away from the blackboard. The lecture hall was dead silent. It was the heavy silence of 200 elite scholars who had all stopped breathing at once, completely stunned by this unexpected genius. Finally, Margaret Whitlock stood up. Saying absolutely nothing, she just stood there. She was a diminutive woman, and her rising wasn't dramatic, yet in that vast silence her gesture rang out like a struck bell. Behind her, another observer stood up in silent recognition. Then the Stanford lecturer, the very scholar who had mocked his notation 40 minutes earlier. He stood up slowly, unable to look away from the blackboard. Then Brennan stood up slowly, almost against his will. Then the row behind him joined until the entire center of the hall stood, a wave of realization rolling outward to the walls. When the applause finally broke, it wasn't the typical polite academic clapping. It was something much deeper. It was a raw, thunderous roar that went on and on. Scholars in the middle rows cheered with their hands raised high, desperate to let this unassuming man know that they truly recognized his genius. The famous Evelyn Carrington stood frozen at the edge of the stage. She stood just 3 feet away from him, her arms limp at her sides. The smug, condescending smile she had worn all evening was completely gone. What replaced it wasn't anger or even embarrassment, but a raw honesty that she simply could not hide. It was the look of someone watching the very ground of their elite world crumble right beneath them. She stared at the blackboard. She stared at the elegant formula written in his neat, humble handwriting. Finally, she looked at the quiet worker, utterly speechless for a long moment. The roaring applause around them made their intense silence easier to bear. When she finally spoke up to be heard over the noisy crowd, her voice was far softer than anyone in the front expected. "What you have just shown us," she admitted, "is a proof unmatched in this department, in any scientific journal or at any conference of my entire career. It is original, it is completely correct, and it is yours." Her voice did not shake, nor did it soften with grace. It was simply a proud academic admitting an undeniable truth because there was nothing else left to say. She offered no apology. She refused to look back at the crowded hall. She turned and quietly walked off the stage. She marched straight up the aisle, past the standing scholars, and exited through the heavy back doors. She never returned, and 4 months later his brilliant paper was fully accepted. It was proudly published in the autumn issue, taking the lead position, introduced by a special note from the editors. They hailed his formula as the most vital mathematical breakthrough in 10 years. The author line listed just one single name, Nathan Cole. No prestigious university or title was listed beneath his name. The editors had asked for credentials, but he simply told them he had none. He continued living in his modest apartment near the train tracks. Every morning he still commuted on the exact same train line, and in the afternoons he still fixed industrial sewing machines in a quiet workshop. However, he did resign from his night shift cleaning job at the university. The prestigious math department offered him a visiting position and a research grant. Along with a quiet third-floor office, his name crudely printed on a card taped to the door. He accepted the office, though he only used it 3 afternoons a week. He chose the humble train and his workshop, proving genius doesn't need a uniform. Now he worked at his kitchen table, scribbling in the margins of books he no longer had to rescue from trash bins. As for Professor Evelyn Carrington, she took a sudden sabbatical right at the end of that spring semester. And when autumn came, she never returned. They quietly deleted her online profile. And her lobby portrait quietly vanished without a single word of explanation. Where she had gone, nobody in the department ever mentioned, and nobody dared to ask. Even Daniel Hayes, the student who had laughed loudest from the back row that evening, was one of the very first to join the small study group Nathan hosted every Thursday afternoon in a third-floor office. He sat quietly in the back taking careful notes. The same scholars who ignored Nathan in the hallways for 4 years now paused to greet him, reaching out to shake his hand. And he warmly shook everyone. Nobody mentioned that dramatic night in the auditorium, and neither did he. You and I know how polite institutions handle their pride. They silently agreed that the truth belonged only to the room that witnessed it. But whatever pride Nathan carried from that room, he carried silently. He had not entered that room to win an argument. He was just there to sweep the floors. The board had simply asked a question he already knew how to solve. And a woman with a microphone had told 200 scholars that a janitor was not allowed to speak. And he went ahead and answered anyway. Because real knowledge never requires a fancy title. Genius does not wear a suit, and wisdom does not need a stage to speak. And sometimes the quiet soul an entire room of experts chooses to laugh at is the only mind in the room who truly understands the problem.